So this all started because I wanted to be able to hit golf balls off my porch. So I thought I'd build myself a tee box. Then that turned into, if I'm gonna go through the effort, I might as well extend it out some. That way I'd have room for a grill and a nice table and chairs for entertaining. Well, then that turned into, I should add on a little bit more so I could put it in a pool. As you can tell, it very quickly snowballed into
a project like this can absolutely be intimidating. However, like everything else I've tackled, whether it be small or large, it's all about breaking it into bite-sized pieces. So stay tuned for this series where every single video will cover a new bite-sized piece that, once all put together, completed this deck. Let's start off with showing you the before shots. Everything here was in pretty decent shape, other than the staircase, but I'll get into that later. So all I did was remove the railing and refinish what was there so that I could start building onto it. The framework for any deck is comprised of 4 main components: the posts, the beams, the joists, and the deck boards. And we start with setting the posts. Different areas will have different depth requirements for how deep you have to dig your hole, so be sure to check with your code before getting started. Next, I put on a post saver sleeve. I do not put a post in the ground without one of these guys. What you need in order to create rot on a post is you need moisture and air, and where the post is most susceptible is about 2 inches above ground level. There's a line here to indicate this goes 2 inches above where the ground level is, and this will protect that zone that is most susceptible to rot. And then the inside of it is lined with a tar-like feature so that it creates a water and airtight seal to prevent oxygen from having access to the post. The sleeve takes heat to shrink it perfectly to size, so I use my propane torch while somebody else turns it. It only takes a few seconds, then I cool it down with a roller dipped in some water. If you have a large job like this one, I personally think it's worth it to rent a mixer so that you can do 3 bags at a time. Remember to slope the concrete away. You don't want to create an area where water can pool. Let me give you guys a tip on using a string line to set posts. A lot of times when you see people pull a string line, they pull it and then they try to set the post up right next to it. The problem is that if you end up bumping it too much, even slightly with one post, you're gonna knock the string out of alignment. What I recommend instead is setting the string line away from it. In this case, it's gonna be 18 inches, so that whenever you set the post, you can then pull your tape, measure over, and hit that mark. All right, and that is all of the posts set. Now let's move on to cutting them to height so that we can set the beams. So this line comes from using the laser level on all of the posts. Once you get the face marked, now you can translate that around using the speed square. My favorite speed square to have on site is this crescent one that goes not only from a 6-inch, but has this very quick flippable ruler that goes to a 12-inch extension. Nope. And repeat. For all of the framing, I'm using Prowood's pressure treated wood, and more specifically for the post, I'm using their label that says "for in the ground." I'll tell you more about their laboring process later. Jacob's now going through and marking off all of the shoulder locations. These headers are going to be attached into an actual shoulder so that they're resting on a notch out on these beams. So he's just using a speed square in order to mark the depth. So the thing with making these shoulders is that the circular saw is not going to have enough throw in order to do it all in one. Like this thing is still attached. So use the circular saw and set the depth in order to make this space cut to where it doesn't go past your shoulder length. In our case, it can be at full depth without going past it. But then make all of the cuts around here, and then as Jake is going through and doing that, I'll come back and finish it off with the Sawzall. So that wraps up cutting in all of the shoulders. The next thing is to start cutting the beams to length in order to set on these shoulders. These are already crowned. You can go through and crown your boards, and then whenever you find where the curve is, you put an arrow on it so that whenever you set these in place, you can make sure that it's facing up. This one is going to go halfway on this post, and then I'm actually going to come back with some screws, but for the meantime, I'm just going to pop in a nail. For the beams, I'm using doubled up 2x12. You want these boards to be as united as possible for strength, and so that means sucking them together. I first used 3-inch Spax power lags to pull the cup out. Then I came back with a framing nailer to nail it all throughout. This was my first job using the Simcoe framing nailer, and I was very impressed with how rapidly it fired off. At the end of setting all the beams in place, it looks a little something like this. The next step is to set the joists. Often you see joists go in hangers and are mounted on the face of a beam. But in this case, they're going to be mounted to the top, which first means that I need to go through and flatten the top of the beam. A chalk line comes in handy to give a visual on the high points. So you can see this corner, how high this last one is. That's what we need to plane down. Next, I used an electric planer to flatten the top. Since the job site was sloped, the lowest beam was pretty easy. The middle section was definitely a shoulder workout, but the far beam was way too above my head. Yeah, how am I gonna reach this? I'm thinking. Guys, is Jacob not the coolest? Look. I was like, Jake, how am I gonna do this? He says you're gonna move the ladder 5 times. So I was like, I don't want to move the ladder 5 times. He goes, fine, I'll build you some scaffolding. And look at this. 2 Spax screws holding in the 2x12s or 2x10s and 1 across. Thank you, Jacob. If you don't have a planer, then another option would be to use a fence and a circular saw to make the top perfectly flat. Okay, now let's start with the third major framing component, which is setting the joist. I'm sistering my joist onto what I can. Roll. Yeah. So at the very beginning, I ended up demoing the rim joist that used to be here, and that is so that we could have access to these joists from the existing deck and sister on these boards to them instead of going with joist hangers on the rim joist. So just 2 different ways of doing it. By doing it this way though, we're not gonna have to cut to length each board. We're just gonna let it run wild into there. But then we do have to notch it in order to get a 2x10 to mate up to this 2x8. And then you can see it down that way. Jacob just set it right on top of it. And this should come out level if we put a level on this. If we did everything right. That's all great.
Right. I don't know, I wouldn't say it.
Yeah, whenever you're deciding how many joists you want, you can either do 24-inch centers, 16 centers, and you can either play with doing 2x8s, 2x10s, and actually using 2x8s or 2x10s, I could have gone to 24-inch centers, but I made the decision to go with 16 in order to not make it so spongy feeling. The cost is very little difference whenever you're looking at it, so I would recommend just sticking on 16s. So the complication here is figuring out how do we make sure what we're doing is going on square to that surface. And so we're actually going to hop to the last one so that we can then pull diagonals and make sure that the structure we're putting in is square. 219 3/4. 20 1/4. Okay. So we're out a half. That's not bad. So out at the beams, I'm gonna have the toenail in the joist, and just a tip is to take off the tip on your nail gun. This is really good whenever you're in bump mode or bumping or nailing on flat, but if you're gonna be toenailing and you take this off, they give you spikes in order to go in at an angle without it moving around on you. The two measurements that I'm really paying attention to here is that all of these tails are the exact length apart, and then that these are falling on 16 on center. Day one, that's a wrap. Cool. Okay, that's my layout. Going back to how to pick out the correct material for your project, I've personally chosen Prowood for all of my pressure treated needs. They not only have super high standards, but they're also used in the latest technology called MCA, where the C stands for copper. I love this because that means that it's not harmful to plants, people, or pets, but it is harmful to microbials that cause rot or fungi. The treated lumber does come in different levels of treatment, so choosing lumber can get tricky, but Prowood has these black end tags that make it easy, whether you need light duty, ground contact, or something else. So whenever setting joists, at the very last step will be to attach a rim joist that connects the tails of each one. It's important to get the overhang of each joist as exact with each other as possible. 9 foot 3/4. So whenever measuring these 16 on center, you never want to go from the top because these aren't plumb this way. They're not square. So you want to go from the bottom. And then what I love about this tape is that it has the numbers on both sides. That makes measuring from the bottom in this case very simple. Before doing anything else, I want to go ahead and do all of the joist taping, which will drastically prolong the life of the boards. The tricky thing about my particular situation is the ground is so uneven, I would have to move a ladder probably 5 or 6 times per joist. To prevent that, I ended up doing some sort of leapfrogging activity where I used 2 2x8s as seats and then just alternated them a little bit as I worked my way back with about 4 or 5 pieces of tape at a time. So I'd progress like the first 2 feet, move my board back, then progress the next 2 feet until I got all the way down to the end. Now on this joist tape, you do want to wrap it around the end and cover up the end grain, which is where the wood actually absorbs the moisture. Me and Cindy ended up developing a process to where she could be on the ladder at the end, covering that last 2 feet. As she was cutting off the tail, she would toss me the roll for me to begin it again. If you don't know, joist tape prevents water from sitting on top of the joist, which it will dramatically prolong the life of your deck. So you trade a few hours of labor for additional years of deck life. As Cindy and I were tackling the joist hangers, Jacob was finishing off the last framing members for the pool. This is the only portion of the deck that actually includes joist hangers, and for this, we are using a Cinco nailer made specifically for joist hanger nails.
And the idea is that this nail is exposed so that you can get this into one of these small holes really accurately, and then the shroud comes over and covers it, and it delivers the nail.
And just like that, folks, we have something that looks like something. The last thing we'll do to conclude framing is add on the rim joist. This is the board that will tie all of the tails of the joist together. However, another important thing it does is plumb the joist. With that, you always start with the board on one end and progress it to the other end of the joist one at a time. As you go, one person should be making sure the top of the rim joist is not only flush to the top of the joist, but that the joist is also at a 90. Once it is, it can be nailed at the top and bottom. It's easiest with 2 people on this job. I use a speed square to check for it being flush and will push or pull it to be flush if it isn't. If the joist is twisted, then I use this really cool crescent hammer with a spur on it to grab the joist and use leverage to twist it straight while telling Jacob top so that he knows he can stick it. Perfect. Top. right, and that is gonna wrap up the first video of the series. I really hope that y'all have enjoyed it as much as I've enjoyed building it. But stay tuned because I still have plenty to build. I'm gonna bring you guys along on the entire thing. I will see you on the next video.